about the same time that all this was happening on the other side of Eurasia, another massive imperial state was in the making. But unlike the Roman Empire, it wasn't so much about creating something new as it was about restoring something to its previous past state of glory. And we've already looked at how China was one of the first civilizations with several early dynasties, including the Jia, the Shang, the Zhao. By around 500 BCE, China had fallen into a period known as the Warring States period. And the typical view or belief of the Chinese was that China was meant to be unified under one ruler who ruled by the mandate of heaven. The period of Warring States was viewed as being unnatural and an unacceptable condition for China. So in this context, and using a strictly authoritarian legalist philosophy, an ambitious ruler known as Qin Shi Huang was able to unify China under his rule. He made China much bigger than it was before. He unified an area that's comparable to modern-day China. And Qin became the first Chinese emperor, and the Qin became the first Chinese dynasty. So, just reviewing the term legalism from our Belief Systems podcast, it's a belief that essentially the individual is stupid and short-sighted, and only the state can govern in the long-term best interest of the people. Because people were ruled by very harsh laws, and anybody that opposed the emperor were systematically executed. The only classes that the state viewed as important were soldiers and farmers. Other classes, merchants, scholars, were persecuted. During the Qin dynasty, hundreds of thousands of laborers were conscripted to embark on some of the largest building projects the world had ever seen. Emperor Qin began the Great Wall of China in an effort to keep out invaders from the north. Emperor Qin's tomb is filled with 7,500 life-size terracotta statues, and these are known as the terracotta warriors. And the thing that's fascinating about these statues is that every single statue is unique, so they have unique facial features, 7,500 unique statues. So the Qin were essentially brutal, and they were overthrown very quickly. The whole length of the dynasty was only around 15 years. And they were replaced by the Han dynasty. And the Han did away with the ideas of legalism, and they promoted Confucianism and Confucian ideals of filial piety and unequal relationships, and they applied those to the way they governed. But the main contribution of the Qin dynasty is they were the ones who were able to unify more or less what we now know as China into one state. And that lasted more or less as a continuous state until the 20th century, or even until today. So the textbook gives a really good comparative analysis of Rome and Han China. I just want to quickly summarize some of the similarities and some of the key differences. And again, you'll find this in the textbook as well. So both Rome and Han China viewed themselves as the greatest empires in the world. Both invested heavily in building projects such as roads, bridges, aqueducts, canals. Both Rome and Han China legitimized their rule through a supernatural mandate. Romans regarded deceased emperors as gods and established religious cults to bolster authority of living emperors. And the refusal of early Christians to take part in this cult led to their persecution. Christians didn't revere emperors, past or present, as gods. In China, emperors were considered the son of heaven, and they ruled by the mandate of heaven, which argued that an emperor could rule as long as they served in the best interest of the people. Both Rome and Han China eventually absorbed a foreign religious tradition. This was Christianity in the Roman Empire and Buddhism in China, although this happened somewhat differently in both empires. Christianity started as a small religious sect in a tiny corner of the empire. From its birthplace, it spread slowly for several hundred years, mostly among poor people, mostly among lower-class people, and this process was aided by the Pax Romana and roads created by the Roman Empire. And after intermittent crackdowns on Christianity in the Roman Empire, Christianity eventually became the official state religion. In the case of China, Buddhism came from India. It was introduced to China by Central Asian merchants and was absolutely never supported by the Han Dynasty. At first, Buddhism spread very slowly in China, and it wasn't until the collapse of the Han in 220 that Buddhism began to gain prominence. So the explosion of popularity of Buddhism in China is likely connected to the fall of the Han Dynasty. So the Han Dynasty ruled for around 400 years, and during that time China was relatively peaceful and relatively stable. So often the spread of religion is connected to a dramatic social change. So you can imagine people living in China. They're living in a relatively stable, relatively orderly society for hundreds of years, and all of a sudden all of that vanished. So they were looking for answers, and Buddhism likely provided some. The Roman and Chinese empires had a very different relationship to the people they governed. Rome began as a small city-state, and this meant that Romans and even Italians were always a small minority in the massive Roman Empire. China grew out of a much larger cultural, ethnic heartland, and people in China were more ethnically and culturally similar than people in the Roman Empire. As China expanded, it assimilated the people they previously viewed as barbarians, and these people learned Chinese customs and learned the Chinese language. The Roman Empire also offered assimilation to its citizens. Slowly over time, Rome offered citizenship to peoples throughout the empire who showed support for the Roman state and who adopted Roman culture and customs. And in the year 212, Rome granted citizenship to all free people living in the empire. And being a citizen of the Roman Empire offered advantages such as the ability to hold office, but citizenship in the Roman Empire didn't destroy separate cultural identities. So Greek Romans, for example, were culturally and ethnically different from Egyptian Romans and so on. So it was a much more diverse empire than the Chinese empires. Finally, both empires established effective centralized control over massive areas with huge populations. And the Chinese, more than the Romans, developed an elaborate bureaucracy that held everything together. The Han Dynasty developed a civil service examination based on the teachings of Confucius. And in the exam, students were given real-world problems and asked to apply the principles of Confucius to solving the problems. And position in the empire bureaucracy were granted based on performance during the exam. And this exam is something that continued until the 20th century in China. So this is the end of episode 6, an introduction to classical civilizations. Next week, we look more in depth at the belief systems that emerged during this time period. And as always, thank you for listening.